Welcome to the Week 10 discussion of common mistakes in the research proposal assignment. This is Jeff Boggs. I will go through these as they correspond to the different sections that you will write. You should watch this video after you've watched the video that elaborates to some degree on the actual assignment. You should also look at the rubric and the written instructions. With that said, let's talk about common problems I've seen in introductions over the past couple of years. The first problem, and this is not a problem that only happens in this course, it's a problem that happens whenever people write introductions, is that the introduction in the research proposal does not match the proposal's contents. What is the solution for this? A way to avoid this problem is to write your introduction after you've written the rest of your proposal. So after you've written your proposal, then write your introduction. That way you actually know what is in your proposal before you write the introduction. So you know what the meat is, if you will, or the essential bits. All right, let's move on to the second problem. Another problem I've seen is that the plan is vague, so it's not really clear to me what the research question is, or the research question can be more precise. It's not clear what the logical structure is. It's not clear what kind of data are being collected. It's not clear how those data that are being collected help answer the research question, and it's not clear how the population or sample are being identified. It's not clear what the sampling procedure is. It's not clear how the data are being analyzed. Any number of those feed into an overall vague research plan. So the solution for this is to make sure that you have a clear research question, identify whether or not this is going to be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods research. My advice is to pick either quantitative or qualitative for the purposes of this course, because that then means you only need to identify one kind of data. If you were going to use mixed methods, your second form of data should be some secondary data that someone else has collected. But I recommend not even bothering with that. I recommend that for the purposes of this project, either pick quantitative or qualitative data. Identify your sample size, your population, your sampling procedure. So is this random, is this non-random? Whichever decision that is, elaborate some more on what kind of random sampling, if, does it have a sampling frame? Or what is the sampling frame? You should have a sampling frame if it's a random sample. Whereas with non-random samples, often, a sampling frame is nice, but it really depends upon the circumstances. Generalizability, you are not going to be able to generalize to a larger population from a non-random sample. So it's fine to not have generalizable findings, but just don't claim that your findings are generalizable if your sample is non-random. Instruments. So instruments are going to refer to your data sheet if you are using detached observation, or your interview guide, or your survey questionnaire. So those are some examples of common introductory problems, so that those bits are not specified. And I recommend that you look at the rubric for the section under introduction to make sure that you cover these, and I think there are a couple of more, but these seem to be the ones that frequently are completely missed. Next, literature reviews also will have problems that I frequently see from year to year. The first is that your lit review reads like a list, or I think in some cases I'll say like a laundry list. We know that that is not the job of a lit review. What you need to do is go back and see the material on writing literature reviews and make sure that you synthesize to find your themes. I'm not going to say anything more about that because I've spoken a lot about that in previous videos in previous weeks. Second problem is that your lit review is unedited from the last version. So this means that when you incorporate your lit review into your research proposal, that you have done absolutely nothing to shrink it down or to fix problems that were identified in your literature review. So it's okay to cannibalize your old literature review for this course, but it's only really supposed to be about 2 pages long. So the solution is to revise your lit review so it is more concise and focused. And I would suggest that it depends on how much time you have, but that you might even wait on writing your lit review until after you start writing your methodology to figure out what actually are you going to do first. I mean, some people will listen to this that do this all the time, write lots of rich research proposals, and might be horrified by that admonition or advice on my part. But it might be that it is easier for you to first just focus on your research methodology. So what you actually are going to do in the field and how you're going to analyze your data, how you're going to collect it, do that first, and then it might make sense to come back and then work on your lit review. Just depends on your process. But hopefully by now your lit review has at least helped orient you to think about different ways that you could conduct research to answer your research question. Now we come to the new part. If this were a full year course, I would have you actually practice writing your methodology in the same way that you practiced writing your lit review, drawing on your annotated bibliography. Unfortunately, we only have a half a year for this course, or 12, 13 weeks. I guess it's 12 weeks. So you're sort of thrown in the deep end here. As a result, there will be many more problems that I discuss here because this is completely novel to many of you. And by this, I mean the writing a methodology. So the first problem that I see is that your plan is not internally consistent. So an example of that might be that you say that your findings are generalizable to a larger population, but you do not use a random sample. Or, so that's just one example. But I think that's another problem that I identify all the time later on in here as well. So another example of a plan not being internally consistent is that you say you're going to conduct interviews, but then you later discuss your survey questionnaire. Interview guides and interviews are different from surveys. Another example might be that you have an interview guide that is actually just a survey. Those are some common examples. Another might be that you say that you're going to do one thing, and later on you never mention that again, and instead you describe doing something else completely. I suppose that's a general way to think about your plan not being internally consistent. All right, so what are solutions? One solution is to outline your methodology before you write it. Make sure the 6 steps fit together logically. Remember, Spickard has 6 steps. These 6 steps are really about your methodology. You'll also want to look at Table 4.1 that talks about the different ways to collect data and the different kinds of data that can be collected. And it indicates what combinations are and are not possible. Make sure that if you are using, if you identify, okay, I need this particular kind of data, what are there, either 12 or 14 kinds? I think there's 12 kinds of data for Spickard. And then you'll notice that not all 12 of those kinds of data can be collected by all 14 forms of data collection. Make sure those match up. What are some other common methodology problems I've seen over the years? Another problem is that a quantitative logical structure is used with qualitative data. So remember, quantitative logical structures for Spickard involve, let me see if I can remember this, experiments, so true experiments, quasi-experiments, ex post facto research, and logical, fiddlesticks, correlations or correlation studies. Those are the first 4 of the 10 logical structures. Those require quantitative data. So make sure that if you're using those, that you identify the kind of quantitative data you need. So there's the solution, right? Don't use the first 4 logical structures with qualitative data. Another is the unjustified use of random sampling with qualitative research. Qualitative research isn't generally interested in making generalizations about the larger population. If you are going to use random sampling with qualitative research, you need to provide a reasonable explanation for why you need to do that. So justify. So here, by justify, I mean justify the use of random sampling, or just use some non-random sampling procedure, right? Like snowball sampling, or one of the other many kinds of non-random sampling. Problem 4, you say you're going to use random sampling, but you do not identify your sampling frame. Remember, your sampling frame is basically a list, though it could also be a grid or, a transect. But you need to specify what your sampling frame is. So if you're going to use random sampling. With non-random sampling, you can often get away without having a formal sampling frame, though you're still going to need to think about who are the kinds of people that you want to either interview or survey. Fifth problem, you have too many data collection techniques. I like ambition. However, for the purposes of this course, I would rather see you execute one technique really well than sort of muddle 2 or 3 together. So the solution to this problem is just to focus on the best data collection technique for what you need to do. And what you need to do is come up with a plan for answering your research question. The 6th problem I have seen over the years is that it is unclear why you are collecting the data that you will be collecting. The solution is to describe why these data are the most appropriate given your constraints. And by constraints, I mean, among other things, A, you're an undergraduate probably collecting primary data for the first time in your life. But you don't need to go into that really. But you do, an important constraint that might be worth mentioning is that you have 3 days to collect your data. But there may also be other kinds of constraints as well. So it might be that in a perfect world, another way of collecting the data would be superior, and you could even briefly acknowledge, that if you specify what that other way might be. So it might be that your lit reviews suggest, oh, most people rely on, repeat interviews with the same people over, 3 times over a 6-month period. So at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of those 6 months. You don't have 6 months, you have 3 months. And so with these, or you don't even have 3 months, you have 3 days. So it might be that you say, optimally, the best way to do this would be to, follow, Luchek 2017, who relied on a series of 3 interviews over a 6-month period with each interview subject. However, I don't have that. However, I have 3 days to collect my data, and for that reason, we instead are going to rely on a single interview with each subject, right? That's an example. So, but the main point is just be clear about why these data are the most appropriate data given your situation. Another problem is that people rely only on secondary data. I love secondary data. In a lot of my research, I'll augment primary data collection with secondary data. And often, for instance, when you make a sampling frame, you're relying on secondary data to do that, like a phone book, or a trade directory, or a membership list, or a map. But you can't just use secondary data for this project. So remember that you're going to go to Peterborough, and you're expected to collect primary data. So if you want, you can talk about, secondary data that you would collect, even though I recommend against that. But it's possible to do that and to do it well. But you want to, in this proposal, identify the primary data you need to collect. Remember, primary data are data that you collect. Secondary data are data that someone else has collected. Another problem, problem 8, is that the instrument is not discussed in the methodology. So if you are using detached observation as your means of data collection, you would want to include a data collection sheet and briefly talk about, what are the things being measured that are going to be recorded on that data collection sheet, and why is that important for answering your research question. The same goes for a survey questionnaire in your interview guide. Also, you'll want to say, something explicit like, in Appendix 1, we see the data collection sheet, period. It contains blah, 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 something like that. So don't just include an instrument and then not discuss it. So the solution is to refer to the instrument. The 9th problem is an inappropriate instrument for data to be collected. So, for instance, you're going to interview people, but you provide a survey questionnaire, or you're going to survey people, but actually your survey consists entirely of open-ended questions. That's really more like an interview. Might be that you want to take, you say that you're going to take soil samples, but actually your instrument has no, slots for entering any kind of measurements that have to do with soil. Instead, it's all about air quality. So you want to make sure that your instrument is appropriate for recording the data that you wish to collect. And again, the solution is know which instruments are appropriate for which kind of data. The 10th problem is one that's unique to this course because we use Spickard's book. So the 10th problem is that you don't use Spickard's terms for the one of the 10 logical structures. So you don't identify what your logical structure is using his terminology. You don't identify your data type using one of his 14 terms. and you don't identify your data collection techniques. Instead, it's just this sort of hodgepodge. If you do that, that makes it hard to evaluate, right? Because it's unclear to me what you actually mean. So the solution is simple. Use Spicker's terms so we know what you mean. The 11th problem is that there's no timeline included. The solution is pretty simple. You add a timeline as a table showing each phase. And remember, in the previous video for this actual assignment, I provided 2 examples of timelines. One for a human geography and tourism studies, one that's more fitting for tourism studies and human geography, and the second was more fitting for physical geography, just to give you a sense of how they might differ. 12th problem is that people will confuse convenience sampling with random sampling. Remember, random sampling requires a sampling frame, and every element in that population has to have an equal chance of being selected. That does not happen with convenience sampling. So, or sometimes I think convenience sampling is referred to as accidental sampling. In any case, convenience sampling is basically if you are handing out surveys and you are outside the door of a supermarket and you had 100 surveys, basically the first 100 people that are willing to answer your survey answer it. That is not a random sample. So that is what is called a convenience sample. So know the difference. So in the past, I had exam questions that asked people about these. This, at least during the year of COVID, we will not have an exam, so you don't have to explain the difference, but you still need to know it for your research proposal. Problem 13, I've harped on this already. The problem is that sometimes people will generalize to the population from a non-random sample. That is a no-no. So limit your generalizations to your sample only, or use random sampling. Problem 14, this is on the rubric that you should identify limitations to your research. Solution is that you need to identify them. So a lot of times people seem to skip this step because they don't read the rubric very closely. You are now warned, right? And limitations take different forms, right? So if you're a physical geographer and you have to go outside and take soil samples or tree rings, or those are the kind of 2 big ones that I'm thinking of, or wade into a stream to take water samples to then measure the number of macroinvertebrates, so water bugs of various sorts, and organisms that live in the water that might be too small or almost too small to see if you've got eyes like I do. In those cases, limitations could be related to the weather. All right. Problem 15 is that you have no contingency plans for data collection. So I'm not expecting a whole extra research methodology tacked on, but I want, and this to some degree relates to your limitations, I am looking for some explicit recognition that going into the field may things don't usually turn out exactly as we plan. So an old metaphor that I've heard military people use before is that no plan survives contact with the enemy, but the point is that at least if you have a plan, some of it often will still work. So contingency plans, or you think of those as like plan B. So if this doesn't work, what might I do instead? So if I'm passing out surveys on a street and nothing's happened for the last 3 hours, maybe I'll move to a different street, right? So, but hopefully you've already, even before you have arrived in Peterborough, you've sort of tried to identify streets that would have more traffic of pedestrians. So, hopefully you don't even have to encounter that problem. But the point here is to begin to habituate you, to begin to train you to think about, all right, if this doesn't work, what are we going to do next? So the solution is briefly describe how you will deal with things like weather problems or low response rates that you might encounter in the field. With regards to the appendix, remember the appendix is going to contain your instrument. So it's either going to be a data collection sheet, a survey questionnaire, or an interview guide. So the first problem is that there simply is no appendix. And remember, I'm interested in an appendix that includes your instrument. Or I suppose the papery part of your instrument. It could be that your instrument is a Schmidt hammer, which is used to measure elasticity or rebound of hard surfaces. And so, like rock facings, for instance. I don't expect you to actually magically shove a Schmidt hammer into your document. Instead, I expect you to provide the data collection sheet that would go along with that. All right. The second problem is that the instrument is inappropriate. So the solution is to make sure your instrument will collect or record the data that you need. So this means that if you have a survey questionnaire, that the survey questions actually make some sense given your research question. So they collect data that will actually allow you to answer your research question. And your paper will end with references or works cited or bibliography, whatever you want to call it. And common problems I've seen are that the information included is incomplete. So this might mean that not all of the last page numbers aren't there, or the issue number isn't there, or the journal name isn't there, or all the authors are not included. So the solution is to make sure all your references are used in the proposal and included in the bibliography. So this can also happen sometimes people leave things out, or sometimes, so it might be that you've got, 10 sources, but you've only included 8 of them. So that, the reverse of that is that you had 10 sources, but you ended up only using 8 of them, but your bibliography still contains 10 sources. So, you want to make sure that the number of sources you have matches the number of sources used in your proposal, and you want to make sure that they include complete information and that they are consistently formatted. So if the journal title is always italicized, it should be always italicized. If it's like, or underlined, or whatever format you're going to use. If you are including people's first names in some of the materials, but not all of them, although that one's a little bit trickier because some journals only use first initials. So in that case, you just want to abbreviate everything to the author's first initials for the first name. If your date jumps around in your references, so it usually people will write, last name, comma, first name, year for a single authored journal article. But there are other systems where that year comes towards the end of the list. I don't care which one you use, just be consistent. So I think this really is a problem for students when they are cutting and pasting from the library webpage, this sort of automatically generated references that can be dropped into bibliography. What you want it to do is make sure that they're all standardized and so that they're all consistently formatted. And the way to catch this is just to proofread carefully. Also, you might look to see if whoever marked your paper, whoever marked your lit review and your annotated bibliography, not so much annotated bibliography, but especially in your lit review, sometimes the person doing the marking will identify when you have incomplete references or when they are inconsistently formatted. So you might check there as well. And that is the end of all the common problems I have seen in proposal writing for Geography and Tourism Studies 2P21. Thank you very much.